verses. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, 'Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me.' But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare, and he went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord." This is the backstory for us on God's mercy. Now, Nineveh was a capital city of the Empire of Assyria. Most likely this story was taking place about 750 years before Jesus, in the time before Israel went into exile to their enemy, Assyria. So Assyria was a major military threat, and Nineveh was a capital city of this empire at this time, known for its violence, known for its advancement in warfare. They had the best chariots, they had the best soldiers, and they were a perverse pagan nation. They had all kinds of ways to torture people that they would take into captivity. And so when Israel would hear this story, when Israel would hear the evil of Nineveh has come up before God, very likely they, like Jonah, would be like, "Great, it is about time. It is smiting time. God has seen the evil, finally, of Nineveh." There would have been a rejoicing of thinking that God is seeing and judging and going to condemn this place, Nineveh. But for God, it's more complex. This sense of evil coming up before God's face can mean the wickedness of the city. It certainly meant that. Their violence has come up before him. But this same word is used throughout the book of Jonah to describe disaster and calamity. In fact, it's the same word that the mariners will call that storm that you read about. So very likely God is evaluating not only the wickedness of Nineveh, but also its consequences, the adversity that this city is living in because of its perversion and injustice. And God, we know, pities Nineveh for this situation. We know this because he tells us at the end of the book. You can flip over to chapter 4, or I'll just give you a spoiler alert, even though I know you're going to go home and read it tonight. You can see at the very last verse of Jonah, God says, "Should I not pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 peoples who don't know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle?" God has pity as he looks down on the evil of this city. And so his answer to that problem is to send through Jonah the word of the Lord, the very beginning of this story. God knows where his word goes, there is an opportunity to repent. There's an opportunity for life to begin again. And there's an opportunity for them to be saved in his mercy. And so he sends the word of the Lord. Now this is a conflict for Jonah, and this will be a conflict for Israel hearing this story, because the word of the Lord for Israel was the heart of their identity. This for us is something casual. We have it on our phones. We can get to it or not. We can listen to it on a podcast. But for Israel, their phrase, Devar Adonai, this was something holy and strange and alien and sacred that God would drop down through their prophets. It was a special privilege to have access to Devar Adonai. And it was a privilege for Jonah to be sent on this mission of mercy to carry it. So when Israel hears this, God sees the evil of Nineveh and wants to send Devar Adonai over there. They're no longer saying, yay! They're saying, boo! This is our identity, God. This is our special thing that makes us a chosen people. And they would be angry. And we know Jonah was angry at this thought, because we know that he fled to Joppa. He gave God a hard pass on the whole assignment. And I've heard it said that Jonah did this because he was afraid to go to Nineveh, or that it was too hard of a journey. But we know the reason that he refused to go, because he also tells us at the end of this book. In verse 4 too, Jonah says he didn't want to go because he knew that God was gracious and merciful.
Mm-hmm.
He knew if he took the word of God to Nineveh that God's mission of mercy would be fulfilled. And he wasn't on board with that at all. And so that's why we see Jonah, ethnocentric, prideful, opposing God in his rebellion. The Christian life is full of choices, isn't it? Maybe not as dramatic as this one. But we too have choices about how will we regard Devar Adonai and where will we take it? What importance will it have for us as the saving power of God to carry a message to people who are hurting? Well, we know the choice Jonah made, and at least for us it makes for a good story. So let's continue on and see. You can look at a map. I printed a map of his journey, just so you can see. Really the point of the map is there's one arrow where he's supposed to go, then there's one arrow where he did go, and just notice they are opposite, okay? He is leaving everything behind. To go to Joppa, it was a port city, and to get on a boat to Tarshish, most likely, archaeologists tell us, was going all the way across the Mediterranean Ocean to Spain, never to be seen again. This wasn't a trip you make back and forth. Jonah is getting away from the presence of the Lord as far as he can go. He is leaving his people, he is leaving his ministry, he is leaving his home, he is probably never intending to come back. He is done with God for God's mission of mercy because it made him so angry. But what's more important than the fact that of where Tarshish was is the fact that we are told 3 times here he was boarding a ship of Tarshish. A ship to Tarshish. This is a trigger word in the Old Testament. You can find it all through the Old Testament. The ships of Tarshish were a big deal in Jonah's time. These ships would make trips, we're told, for King Solomon every 3 years. They were the best ships that could be designed at the time. They had the best sailors, and they were laden down with all kinds of wealth and treasure as they would make these journeys. They would have gold and iron and slaves and soldiers and giant caskets of Phoenician wine, which was a very big trade at this time. And they would even have apes and peacocks, we are told, for use in the royal palaces. It's a big deal. Jonah here is choosing the very best that the world has to offer, the most powerful means that the world can muster in his rejection of what God would have him do. He is making a very definite choice. In fact, in the Bible, this should be a trigger to the reader because in the Bible, for a ship of Tarshish to sink is a very big deal. It's a poetic justice. It's an irony that God is so powerful, he can even sink a ship of Tarshish. So we should be worried about Jonah getting on this boat. And he probably paid all he had to be able to afford this passage. But he's not intending on coming back, is he? Well, he gets on this ship then, and we know his intent to get away from the presence of the Lord because he opposes the mercy of God. And that is essential. That is our essential conflict in this story. Will God's mission of mercy prevail among the pagan world? Or will Jonah's obstinance? I think you can probably guess what the ending of the story will be. Look at this storm now that breaks out as God is determined to exercise his mercy in the world. It says, "But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, 'What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish.'" Now, obviously, this storm is a physical reality that is terrifying, right? They are at peril. They don't have GPS. There's no Coast Guard. The ship is going to snap apart, and they're all going to die and never be seen again. That is a very scary reality. But for these mariners, this was also a spiritual crisis. This would have been seen as a spiritually terrifying thing. Now, these were pagans from a pagan culture. They had their false gods that they were crying out to, but don't underestimate their spirituality. They saw and recognized in this storm something of divine purpose. That's why they're calling out to their gods, trying to appease the gods, trying to figure out who behind nature is controlling the nature that has turned against them, the evil that is happening in their lives. That's why when they use this word, let us not perish, this is a soul word that they are using. They are asking for some kind of salvation for their souls because they recognize a spiritual reality. In fact, we know from history that Joppa, this port city where they left, was full of temples where people were making offerings to their different gods, and the offerings were specifically designed to make sure that they would not suffer a curse at sea. As they were leaving on these ships of Tarshish, they didn't want the gods to get angry and put them in the storm. So the pagans catch on quickly here. They understand there is something spiritual behind the storm, even if they don't quite understand how to interpret it. And we know from the Bible that very often a deluge of water is connected to something spiritual, isn't it? If you have heard of Noah and the flood, we know that for the Hebrew reader and for Jonah, they too should have been thinking there is something spiritual at work in this storm, and there is a threat of spiritual condemnation at work. And I had to ask myself about the storms that I go through. Am I looking behind them for God's activity? Am I recognizing his divine power? We know that God orchestrated this one because it says he's the one that hurled the wind that created it. But that is the same for us in our storms of life, isn't it? I'm not talking about bad days. We all have bad days. I'm talking about sometimes we use the phrase, I'm going through a perfect storm. A phase of life where how can one more thing even be happening to me? How can all these things be happening at once? I think a lot of us went through that with COVID, right? I did. I am still recovering. My family, my husband lost his job after COVID. We moved out of state. It was horrible. It provoked a lot of depression in me and in my family. We struggled financially. Someone that I loved had come to the end of her very difficult cancer journey and died. And it's that kind of a phase where you start thinking, God, are you actually listening to this? Are you actually there? It can feel very dark and isolating and confusing. But we have to be smart. We have to use our brains. We have to look to Devar Adonai to understand his mercy in the storm, don't we? Well, that's what these soldiers, these sailors were trying to do in crying out to their gods. They just didn't know their right from their left. They just didn't know which God is in charge of the storm, but they instinctively understood that some kind of appeasement was needed. And that's how we are too. Look around at your friends with the crystals and the manifesting and the sage in their house, okay? We're all just trying to figure out how to be stable in these storms that God is in control of. Well, their gods did nothing for them because they're not real. And so what happens now? They move on from the false gods and they just start to their practical wisdom. They start hurling this cargo into the sea to lighten the load. That was a smart thing to do, trying to survive in this storm. This is exercising their practical wisdom, casting off their wealth, though. All this treasure, casting off the very job that they had for being on that ship. And the storms will bring us to that too, won't they? As we start to just get rid of everything we thought was so precious, just trying to survive. Well, there is God's mercy in this. Recognize that the sailors are using a kind of differential diagnosis as they're starting to realize what won't save them in the storm. They're starting to come to grips that their false gods are not going to come to their rescue and that their practical wisdom and remedies are going to run out. But that is God's wisdom sometimes for us. God's mercy for us sometimes is to bring us to that place where at least we know that we don't know. At least we know that whatever we thought was going to give us hope is actually not the answer. There's mercy in that because what we see in this section of the story is God uses the storm to reveal our need for his mercy. He uses it to bring us to that place where we just have to ask him what he would do in his power over the storm. But if only there was someone was in charge of the storm. If only there was someone who had the job, the one job, of carrying Devar Adonai to the pagans to let them know who is in charge. Where do we find him, though? Fast asleep, down in the bottom of the boat. This is bizarre to me, because even though we get it, Jonah is a rebel, right? He's over it. How is he sleeping in this giant storm, as the boat, we are told, is threatening just to come apart? This is so fascinating to me. Well, guess what? The scholars don't know. The scholars don't know what this means, because this description in Hebrew for being fast asleep is not the verb for sleepy time sleep, like we're going to do later tonight. But it's a specific description that describes a very strange, almost being in a trance, being stunned into being asleep. That's what the writer is telling us was the state of Jonah. And people debate this. Was he stunned because he's just so over it? He cannot even. He's just so terrified of the storm, or maybe, I don't know, hit that Phoenician wine a little bit too hard, and he's just knocked out. Or is this a kind of a prophetic moment of transformation for Jonah? Other times in the Bible, when we hear about someone being entranced in this way, that gets translated fast asleep, but entranced, it's a prophetic turning point. Daniel is described the same way in Daniel 8. He has a vision of the Lord's power. He goes fast asleep in a trance, and he receives a vision from the Lord. Very possibly, Jonah is face down before God here. Very possibly, Jonah has seen the storm of the Lord, and he has seen God's winds being cast upon the waters, and he is clued into the fact, I'm on a ship of Tarshish. God cannot be escaped, and he has gone to ready himself for what God will do next. That's my opinion, because what we see happen in Jonah next is a big transformation. But I think possibly we are meant to just lean into the ambiguity. Hebrew is a very beautiful and poetic language. Maybe we're not meant to know the answer to that question, but we're just meant to ponder it. Because when we hit the storms of life and people are looking to us for the word of God, maybe we need to ask ourselves the same question that the captain asked here. What do you mean by sleeping? Are there not women all around us in Sacramento just screaming out in their fear of the storms and looking to their false gods and coming to the end of their practical wisdom? What is with me sleeping? Am I just done? Am I just burnt out? Or am I face down before the Lord, asking him, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to have me do about it? I don't know. I think it's a question that I just need to ponder. Well, for these men confronting Jonah, their practical wisdom and their false gods have run out, and so now we see their search begins. I have to applaud these men because I think it would be reasonable if they just gave up and accepted drowning at this time. But they don't. They start searching. They start asking their questions because they are persistent, wanting to know what God is in charge here. What God is in charge, and how do we have to appease him so that we might live? I commend this search that they go on. And it's interesting that they use lots here. Let's see what happens. They said to one another, come, let us cast lots that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. They're saying, whose God is offended here? Who do we have to deal with? So they cast the lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. And then they said to him, tell us, on whose account this evil has come upon us? What is your occupation? Where do you come from? Where is your country? What people are you from? And he said to them, I am a Hebrew. I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid, and they said to him, what is this that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. It's so fascinating that God works through their casting of lots. because this is divination. This is a witchcraft practice of a pagan culture using some kind of, you have a question?
What is that mean?
Yeah, the lots, it's like dice. It's like rolling dice. So it's like, that's such a good question, thank you. Yeah, it's like, they probably at that time, archaeologists have found like shards of bone that they would make symbols on, or like the Romans would use like pig knuckles, or, you know, they had dice. So the point of it is to like toss it out, and then they're trusting the gods to make it land on the right thing so that they can know who offended God, who caused this problem. So it's a divination. It's a kind of like, we would have tarot cards, or, well, people use divination today, all different kinds of ways of doing that. So like Magic 8 Ball, sometimes that's just a toy, but like, this was not a toy. Yeah, thank you, that's a good question. So they are doing this because they're trying to manipulate the gods. They're just trying to figure out who's out there. It's so fascinating that God would condescend himself to work within that, right? Because divination is against his word. He has said, do not do this. But he's willing because their search is earnest. If you seek him, you are going to find him. And he is merciful. And so he allows the lot to fall on Jonah. Now they know somehow Jonah's God is offended, and somehow Jonah is going to know how to mediate this in their search for answers to live. And they ask good questions, right? Because now that they've isolated on the one who carries Devar Adonai, they want to know, what is your mission and who gave it to you? These are good questions in their search for truth, and in their search, even though it's an awkward search, a search to know what God is really operating in this storm. Isn't it beautiful that God is also working on Jonah here in his mercy? You see that? He's reinstating Jonah. He's causing Jonah to confess his true identity, who he really is, a worshiper of the Lord. But he's also causing him to teach them something terrifying, which is the Lord that he worships, who's in charge of this storm, is the Lord not only up in heaven, but also over the sea and also the dry land. You see, he's saying there's nowhere, he has discovered there's nowhere he can go that is away from the presence of the Lord, because he's real and he controls all of it. No wonder the men are growing exceedingly terrified, because in this moment, they know that there is a real God in heaven who judges and has power, but they don't know how to appease him. What a terrifying state to be in for them. And so they ask a very good question here, as they have found the source of the mercy that they need. They ask the question, what do we do? It's no wonder that they were thinking, Jonah must be crazy. What is this thing you have done, right? But they quickly go to asking him, what do we do? God answers our search and our questions that are earnestly brought to him by revealing that his mercy comes from him alone. And he will lead us in our questions too, but make no mistake, it's going to come through his word, right? Just as it did with Jonah. Well, they ask a good question. Now what? What should we do? Look at verse 11 as we're going to finish out our story. Then they said to him, what shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea, and then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life. Lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. So they picked up Jonah, and they hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. It's fascinating here. The mariners instinctively understand a couple of things. They understand that some kind of appeasement is needed. There's going to have to be some kind of atonement if this God they just found out about is going to stop the storm and let them live. And they understand that that atonement is going to involve some kind of a sacrifice. What should we do to you, Jonah, so that we can live? They understand this instinctively, and they understand that that's going to involve some kind of punishment for sins. They are connecting their adversity to their guilt, or to Jonah's guilt in this case. You know, Christians get fussy about these concepts. It's nerve-wracking to tell other people, but the world can instinctively understand this. These mariners didn't have any religious training about the God of the Hebrews, but they just get it as a gut instinct, right? That there's some kind of appeasement that's needed. And so Jonah gives them the solution from the Lord here. Pitch me into the sea, and then it's going to calm down for you. In his death, they're going to be able to live. I don't blame them for then rowing hard to get to dry land. They do not like this solution. Probably because it offends their morality. This man may have chartered the whole boat, I've read from historical record, but he certainly paid a lot to be on this boat. And so now it would offend their morality to throw him over, right? But the bigger problem is this solution being told to them is coming from such a broken witness. He just got done telling them what a sinner he is. He just got done telling them the reason you found me asleep on this ship so far from my people is I'm trying to flee the God of heaven. What is this thing you've done? That's what they had to ask him because he had no credibility at all. And that's very hard, isn't it? It's very hard for me. It's very hard for the people we know in this day and age. When the message of how to be saved is true, but it comes from a broken witness. I saw the Hillsong documentary. Okay, I don't even know if those guys are Christians from some of the stuff I heard them doing. It is very hard when the truth of salvation comes from a broken witness. But understand that rowing for dry land was a suicide mission for these guys. To row for dry lands in a storm was to risk crashing their boat against the rocks. They knew that. They were trained sailors. There was no way that they would be able to survive that. It is foolish to reject the truth of God just because it comes from a broken witness. Well, we just got to get directly then. We just got to go to his word ourselves, right? We can't let that make us be on some kind of crazy mission rowing for dry land of our own making. Well, they row hard until finally they have to accept that they will have no mercy outside of God's prescribed plan. And so thank God the moment of truth as they get ready to throw Jonah into the water. If they throw him in and the sea calms down, then he really was a prophet. Then there really is a God in heaven who can be appeased, who they can worship and not perish. But if they throw him in and he just drowns and the storm keeps going, then they know his God is just as fake as theirs and they have no mercy coming. There is no hope for them. Thank the Lord that what happens is they throw him in and it says the sea ceases. Immediate. This is a miracle that we're being told about. This is not a general passage of the weather, but it stops like that. Can you imagine what that meant to them? To see that there is a God in heaven. No wonder their response was to fear him and worship him as the God who saves. His mercy for our sins brings life at the cost of a sacrifice, doesn't it? That's what he's showing us through this story. Let me ask you, who is the hero of our story tonight? It's not the mariners, right? They barely survived. It's definitely not Jonah. We know that, right, from the way the story ends for him. He is not our hero. The hero of this story would not come along for another 750 years. The hero of this story is the greater Jonah, the man who would come not from Israel to Nineveh, but from heaven to earth to fully fulfill God's mission of mercy, out of compassion, out of pity for the whole earth, all of the peoples to come. Jesus Christ, the greater Jonah, willing to travel for God's mercy, not just bringing Devar Adonai, but Devar Adonai made flesh. The Word living as a person who confronts the storm, not just to give a mediation, but to totally control the everything that the Father commanded him. And he said everything that the Father told him to say until he was sacrificed to give appeasement for sin. Not sin that he had committed, but sin that we had committed. So that if we'll trust him, like those mariners had to trust God, we will receive instant mercy. And we'll always be able to count on him in every storm that comes. So for now, we want to abandon all of our other sources of hope. Just lay them down. Just cancel them out and put all of our hope on God and his mercy. We want to take our questions to the Lord. Take our searching to his word until he will answer them for us in the storm. And then we want to trust. The cost of our forgiveness has been paid, and his mercy